So we skipped the Agadita, and therefore we're up to Kuf Yud Tes Amid Beis. And yesterday we started the Gemara of Afikomen. We're trying to figure out what does Afikomen mean. And we have machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. According to Rav, as we discussed yesterday, Afikomen means that if you started eating the Pesach, the Korban Pesach in one place, then you're not allowed to up and move to another place because we have a principle called Ein Okrin Michabura Lechabura. According to Shmuel, we're talking about not being Oker Mokom, not by picking yourself up and moving from one location to another. Even if you stay in your same location, we are not allowed to eat a dessert after the Korban Pesach. And that means we can't eat certain kinds of vegetables that they used to bring for Kinuach Seuda. And the reason for this is because of a principle called Shehei Tam Basar HaPesach Befiv, that there should be a continuous taste of the Korban Pesach in his mouth. And the Gemara concludes by telling us that there are certain specific kinds of sweets that they used to bring at the end of the meal. And after the completion of the Achilas HaPesach, you were not allowed to partake in those sweets, like, for example, Tamarim, Kloyos, and Agozim. And this would support the opinion that not only is there a problem after the Afikomen of picking up and relocating yourself somewhere else, but even to eat a dessert after the Afikomen in that very same place, that's prohibited. What about matzah? Today, we don't have a Korban Pesach. Is there a requirement of completing the Seder by eating the Afikomen at the very end of the Seder in such a way that there's no Afikomen? That means there's no dessert after the matzah. So we're up to Amar Rav Yehuda Meshmuel. So let's count up from the bottom of the Amud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines up. And we're on Kuf Yud Tes Amid Beis. 6 lines up before the end of the Amud. Amar Rav Yehuda Meshmuel, Ein maftirin achar matzah afikomen. That even though Bizman Hazeh we don't have the Pesach, but we do have a replacement, or shall we say a substitute for the Korban Pesach, and that's the matzah that we eat at the end of the Seder. And that's called the Afikomen. And Rabbi Yehuda says, in the name of Shmuel, that just like at the time that the Pesach was eaten, when the Mikdash stood, we were enjoined from eating a dessert after the Achilas HaPesach, so too, in our time, we are enjoined from eating after the matzah because we treat the matzah as if it were the Korban Pesach. It's an exact replication or replacement for the Korban Pesach, and just like we have to have Tam Korban Pesach Befi, he has to retain that taste of the Korban Pesach, so too, in our time, he has to retain that tam of the matzah. And therefore the matzah is eaten at the end of the meal, just like the Korban Pesach was eaten at the end of the meal. Anybody know what that's called in halachic terms, to eat a korban at the end of a meal? That's called al hasova. What does al hasova mean? When he's already satiated, not totally satiated, but he's almost at the point of full satiation. And that's when he eats the kudshim, the Korban Pesach. So too the matzah should be eaten al hasova at the end of the meal. He's almost full. All he has in his belly is room for that last kizayis of afikoman. And the Chachamim made a takana that matzah should be eaten at the end of the Suda al hasova in a way that you should not be eating anything after the matzah, and that's called zecher lematzah bizman hamikdash. The matzah was eaten together with the Korban Pesach at the time of the Beis Hamikdash, And when you ate the Korban Pesach at the end of the meal, you were not permitted to eat anything after the Achilu of Korban Pesach. And so too, in our day, even in the absence of the Korban Pesach, we still have the matzah, and that matzah is going to be a zecher leKorban Pesach. Where do we find in the world of halacha examples of zecher, where we do something today, even without the Beis Hamikdash, as a zecher to remember the Beis Hamikdash? Anyone want to suggest an example or two, even of zecher leMikdash in our time? Okay, that's not a bad idea, matzah shekel, but I don't know if matzah shekel is a real obligation. I'm talking about a real full-fledged obligation. What about Sfiras HaOmer? We don't have the Korban HaOmer, but yet we count the Omer. We even make a bracha on it, Zeichel HaMikdash. What about Lulav? We take the Lulav how many days? 7 days. Why? The Torah only says B'Yom HaRishon, but we do it Zeichel HaMikdash. So we have a number of examples of mitzvahs that we implement in order to remember the Mikdash, and now we're adding to that list the matzah that we eat at the end of the meal, not the matzah that we eat at the beginning of the meal. That matzah at the beginning of the meal is for the mitzvah of matzah, but erev tochlu matzahs. But why do we eat a second matzah at the end of the meal, ala sova? That's a zecher to the Korban Pesach that was eaten at the end of the meal, and therefore ein maftirin achar matzah fikol. We don't eat anything after the matzah. Again, we'll have to discuss the question of the fourth kos, which is drunk actually after the afikoman, and why is that a problem of, so to speak, undermining the tam matzah b'fi? And the Gemara says the following. Tanan, let's learn our Mishnah, and apparently our Mishnah contradicts the statement of Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel. The Mishnah says, Ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman. The afikoman is prohibited after what? What does the Mishnah specify? Joe, can you help me out here? What does the Mishnah specify? The Pesach. It doesn't say anything about matzah. So let's be medayik in the language of the Mishnah. Achar Pesach hutalo ochlin afikoman. We can't eat a dessert after the Pesach. Aval achar matzah maftirin. We're allowed to eat our dessert after the matzah. This is against Shmuel. If the Mishnah would agree with Shmuel, the Mishnah shouldn't have limited itself to ein maftirin achar Pesach afikoman, but rather should have added the word matzah. Ein maftirin achar Pesach, meaning bizman hamikdash afikoman. V'ein maftirin matzah achar ein maftirin achar achilas matzah bizman hazeh, when we don't have the Korban Pesach. So Gemara says lo mi boiko. So once you get familiar with the structure and the methodology of the Talmud, because what we're about to learn is something that's very, very typical. And it's part of the entire methodology of the Talmud. If you are medayek that why didn't he tell me this and he only told me that, then I will counter by saying that by telling me that, he adds a new chiddush, something novel that I would not have entertained. That's called in the language of Shas lo mi boy kama. In other words, it goes without saying in your case that you want the Mishnah to mention, that didn't even have to be mentioned. The Mishnah is going to tell you an even more, a greater chiddush, a greater novel idea. Lo mi boy achar matzah. I understand very well why you should not be eating a dessert of dates or nuts or klayos, are those, they used to have these roasted stalks of grains. For sure you shouldn't be eating that after matzah, because lo nofesh tamayu, matzah doesn't really have a very strong taste. So that once you eat something else, you start eating dates or nuts or whatever you might want to eat, you're going to lose the tam matzah. The chiddush is even basar, even aval yachar Pesach the nofesh tamayu. It could be that you would entertain the idea that since Pesach, which is basar, has a very strong taste. In fact, you remember, as we discussed in the past, the Gemara Chulin, that the taste of the basar comes up from his belly for 6 hours. That's why we don't eat milchiks after fleishiks. So the taste of basar is something strong, it's something powerful. And therefore, lo matzi lebure, abure means to get rid of it. In other words, the taste will linger on. Even if you have a little bit of a sweet, some nuts and some dates and so forth and so on, you still have that fundamental taste of basar in your mouth. And therefore, I would say, less lanba. We shouldn't be makbid. We shouldn't have to be careful about eating after basar. Kamash Malan, the Tana wants to tell me a bigger chiddush, something even more novel that's called Lomi Boy, to tell you that even though the tam matzah is a very strong tam, nevertheless, you're not allowed to eat. In other words, the prohibition here applies even to a partial, shall we say, a partial uprooting of the tam. You'll still feel the tam basar even after you eat some desserts, but you lose some of that tam basar. We want the full-fledged tam basar to be befiv. And therefore, the Mishnah didn't even have to mention matzah. For sure, you're not going to eat anything after the matzah, because then you'll lose the tam matzah. Matzah is a very soft, relatively soft tam. But even after the Pesach, which is basar, we're not going to let you eat anything. No dessert. We want tam Pesach befiv. Even though that dessert will not undermine completely and negate the tam Pesach, it's a very strong, profound tam, but it will diminish the tam. We're not allowed to diminish the tam. To, shall we say, water it down. We don't know water down the tam at all. Name it Misayele. You know what? Let's see if we can quote a brisa to prove and support the sheet of Shmuel. Now, this brisa that we're about to learn is focused on what we call lechem oni, right? The Torah says in chapters Tezayin 16 of Sefer Dvarim that we have an obligation to eat matzah, but it doesn't say the word matzah, it says lechem oni. Lechem oni, the poor man's bread, is made of 2 ingredients, and only 2 ingredients: water and flour. As soon as you add other ingredients, like, for example, honey or sugar or things like that, and certainly not fruit juices, it loses its status as lechem oni. It's not a poor man's bread. The poor man's bread is absolute simplicity. And by the way, we're not studying Hashkafa here, but in Tamei HaMitzvahs, there's a whole long discussion about simplicity. The matzah represents simplicity. Water and flour and nothing else. So we have a case called sufganin. Sufganin are kind of like rolled dough that almost look like a sponge, a sfog. That's why it's called sufganin, miloshin sfog. And the dough is very soft, and it doesn't have the status of lechem. It's almost a pourable liquid batter. You've seen it. You know, when you make bread, you have a very hard dough. But when you make sufganin, you can actually pour the batter. It's pourable. That's how soft it is. And you can make a cake out of it, and you can make different kinds of donuts and muffins, lamine, and whatever you want to make. That's called sufganin. Now we have something called duvshanin. Duvshanin is a dough that's fried together with honey. Honey. And that is the bread of a rich person, lechem osher. It's anything but the simple bread of lechem oni. Is adam emali kreso mehem ubilvad sheyochal kezayis matzah bachron. If he wants on the night of the Seder to eat all these cakes and sufganin, and he wants to eat duvshanin, go ahead. as long as it's not chametz, you can eat as much as you want. But don't think that you can fulfill the mitzvah of matzah with sufkinin or duvshinin, because those are not lechem oni, but rather what? Lechem ashir. So therefore, eat as many duvshinin and sufkinin as you'd like, to your heart's desire, but make sure that at the end of the meal you will eat what? You will eat matzah. But what word does this brisa add that we should emphasize in terms of the answer to the question, when should be eating the matzah, the kazais matzah of lechem oni? When? Bachrona. You see that word bachrona? Bachrona. The matzah should be eaten bachrona. What does it mean bachrona? At the end of the meal.
Well, it's after his dessert.
After his dessert, he had sufkinin and he had duvshinin and he wonderful. He had all these lovely delicacies. And he ate a matzah at the beginning of the Seder. But now he's got to eat another matzah bachrona to close the entire achila of that night. The final achila has got to be a kazayas matzah bachrona, in addition to the kazayas matzah that he ate barishona at the beginning of the Seudah. So the Gemara's medayik, bachrona in, you must eat this matzah bachrona. That's when you're required to. But here we turn to kuf chav, barishona lo. If you eat that matzah at the beginning of the meal, then you have not fulfilled your obligation. Why? Because what's going to happen after the original first matzah? You're going to eat the meal. Well, Shmuel says, Ein maftirin achar matzah. After you eat the matzah, you don't eat anything. So it must be that Shmuel, in light of this price, is going to tell you that after the first matzah you eat, but after the last matzah you don't eat. And that's what it means, kizayis matzah bachrona. In a sense, matzah will open the Suda and will close the Suda. Now, what happens to a person who has only one kizayis matzah? That's all he has access to. If he eats it at the beginning of the Suda, then he doesn't have the fulfillment of kizayis matzah bachrona. If he eats it at the end of the Suda, then he didn't have the matzah at the beginning of the Suda. And if he wants to start with matzah and end with matzah, he's got a problem because he only has one single kizayis. So if he splits that kizayis in half, he's going to have half a kizayis at the beginning of the Suda, half a kizayis at the end of the Suda. So if you take a look here, in the Masifta, he adds a few words here. So Joe, you don't have that, but you may have it in your notes. I don't know. He says the following. Im eno yochol lechol bimena, from this one kazayas, he cannot eat gam betchilas asud v'gam besofa, because then he doesn't have a kazayas of achila, yochlena besof. This brisa is telling you that you should wait till the end of the meal. You will not eat matzah at the beginning of the meal. Mipnei shachrei also lechol shal dvarim. If you want to fulfill the matzah at the end of the meal, you won't be able to eat anything afterwards. So by definition, if you only have one kizayis, you're going to have to postpone eating that kizayis till the end of the meal. Kidei shelo yaviru es tama, he will not lose the taste of the matzah. He'll be able to maintain that taste. Whereas im yochlena b'tchila, if he will eat the matzah at the beginning, then he won't be able to eat a Suda afterwards. So what we're going to do is we're going to encourage him to eat the Suda. And that one single kizayis matzah he should leave for the end of the meal. Now, if he has an abundance of matzah, Baruch Hashem, he bought a whole box of matzah, then yochel b'tchilas hasuda kizayis matzah, and kizayis matzah bachrona at the end of the meal. After he eats the kizayis matzah at the end of the meal, no more eating of matzah. But in event that he has only one single kizayis matzah, then which matzah should he eat? the matzah at the beginning or the matzah at the end? Which mitzvah should he designate this kizayis for? I would have said the first one. I mean, that's the ikar mitzvah of matzah. But once I do that, I don't have a matzah to eat at b'achrona because I'm going to eat my meal after the matzah b'rishona. And then I won't be able to be mekayim the mitzvah of matzah with tam matzah b'fiv. So I don't want to forfeit that mitzvah. Therefore, instead of eating matzah b'rishona, I'm going to wait till the end of the meal, eat my matzah b'achrona. I only have one kazayis, and I won't eat anything afterwards. Now you have another question. Let's say he has two kizaysim. So we said if he has two kizaysim of matzah, he'll eat one kizayis at the beginning of the meal and another kizayis at the end of the meal. Well, there's one bracha, asher kitzonim mitzvos tzmano al achilas matzah. When should he make that bracha? What would be your answer? He only's going to make one bracha, but now he has two kizaysim of matzah, one at the beginning of the meal, one at the end. When should he make the bracha?
Why would it be at the beginning of the meal?
He has two kizaysim. So the meal starts with the first kizayis.
Right, you have to make a bracha.
Oh, but why do you make the bracha on the first kizayis? Why not make the bracha on the second kizayis at the end of the meal?
That's your whole meal. You're making it's the part of the mosi.
Well, I think Joe is right that he should make the bracha at the beginning of the meal. But Joe is saying because he makes a hamotzi lechem min haaretz, but I don't know if hamotzi lechem min haaretz is relevant to al achilas matzah. Shekid sharu mitzosav v'tzimonu is a birchas hamitzvah.
Maybe that's why we do it together.
Well, why? Why should it be done together? That's what we're trying to figure out. Why not just make hamotzi lechem min haaretz on the first kizayis matzah, and then when you get to the last kizayis at the end of the meal, make shekid sharu mitzosav v'tzimonu al achilas matzah. Ruvain, are you? Well, John, are you with me? Can you? You'll have to unmute yourself here. Why would the Gemara object to the following? You have two kizaysim. You need one kizayis at the beginning of the meal and one at the end of the meal. Let's wait till we get to the last kizayis. Bachrona, and then make the bracha. Asher kitzonim mitzvos tzmano al achilas matzah. Can you raise your voice and drop louder? It froze. No, it didn't freeze. What?
I think there's some saying that he fulfilled by and at the end of the meal, and so therefore.
I think, Ruven, you have to move around a little. Like find that spot where we can hear you.
I was. There's a Havamina to say that perhaps on the first kizayit he fulfilled the mitzvah and not on the last kizayit.
So since he fulfills his mitzvah with the first kizayit, therefore he should make the bracha on the first kizayit. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
John, do you agree with that?
Yes, I agree with that.
And what principle would apply here that applies to Birchas HaMitzvah?
Over the Asisa.
Excellent. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you very much, John. Over Lasiyos. Every mitzvah requires a bracha before you engage in the Ma'aseh mitzvah. And if you're going to wait to make the bracha till the end, when you eat the afikomen matzah, that last kizayis b'achrona, then the bracha will not be over Lasiyosam, because you've already had the first kizayis of matzah barishon at the beginning of the meal. Now let's just make the following comment. There are two kizaysim and two mitzvahs. The first kizayis is the mitzvah of Erev Tochlu Matzahs. The second kizayis is really Zeichel Korban Pesach. Fine. So again, now where are we holding? We have a brisa that says Ubilvad sheyochel matzah b'achrona. And what does b'achrona mean? B'achrona means after he completes his meal. This would support Shmuel. And the Gemara rejects. Lomi boy ka'amar, lomi boy b'rishona deka'achel l'teyama. Aval b'achrona dilma asi l'meichel achila gasa eimolo. The Gemara now raises the following possibility. Perhaps we are not going to encourage him to eat matzah at the end of the meal. And we will only encourage him to eat the matzah at the beginning of the meal. And that's what this brisa is coming lafuke. What havamina? The havamina would be that, you know what? We don't want him to eat the matzah b'achrona. If he eats the matzah b'achrona, then we have to be afraid of something called an achila gasa. Like we said before, he eats the matzah b'achrona ala sova, but he's not completely satiated. If he's already completely satiated, basically his stomach is full, he's just pushing in, he's force feeding another piece of matzah. That's going to be an achila gasa. And we're not going to allow him to eat an achila gasa at the end of the meal. So let's read the Gemara again. Lomi boy kama lomi boy barishona. It goes without saying that he's allowed to eat matzah barishona to ka'achal te'ova. He now has an appetite. It's the beginning of his meal. He has nothing in his belly. Well, I might think that b'achrona at the end of the meal, we have to be worried about the possibility of an achila gasa. Since he's already satiated, he's already eaten the meal, it's almost like repulsive for him to eat more. And therefore, that's called an achila gasa. Emolo. Perhaps we would say that he's not allowed to eat matzah b'achrona. Kamash malon, the Tana wants to say that we don't have to worry about this. He's allowed to eat his matzah at the end. So you were medayik from the language of the Brisa b'achrona in Barishona lo, as if to say that he should not eat the proper matzah at the beginning of the meal, because then he's going to be mavatal the tam matzah by eating his meal after the matzah. No. For sure, we're going to allow you to eat the matzah at the beginning of the meal because there's no chashash and no suspicion of achila gasi. You're hungry, and therefore, if you're hungry, it's l'te'ava. But at the end of the meal, maybe we should discourage him from eating matzah because maybe he'll eat matzah when he's so full, so satiated, that the matzah will be an achila gasa. Achila gasa is not considered an achila because it's repulsive. Mashmallah, no. The Tana wants to say, no. He's going to eat matzah b'achrona. We're not going to be afraid that he's going to overdo it and eat the matzah as an achila gas. So again, Rabbosai, according to Shmuel, if you have only one kizayis matzah, when are you going to eat that kizayis matzah? Barishona b'achrona. Bachrona. Why? Kidei shetei tam matzah befiv and ein maftir nachar matzah fikol. The havamina was that if he only has a kizayis matzah, he should delay. I'm sorry. if he only has a kezayis matzah, you might think that he should eat it barishona. And why is that? Because it's l'teyomon and there's no chashash of achila gasa. But don't eat it b'achrona. No. The price is going to tell you a chiddush that you should eat the matzah b'achrona. And we're not afraid that you'll overdo it and you'll eat it achila gasa. And after you eat the matzah b'achrona, you're not allowed to eat anything past that because ain't maftir achar matzah afikomen like Shmuel. Mar Zutra masni hachi. Mar Zutra had a different transmission. Omar Rabbi Yosef, Omar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, maftirin achar matzah afikomen. You're allowed to eat a dessert in our time when we don't have the Pesach after the matzah. So that although you're not allowed to eat after the Korban Pesach because you have to have Tam Pesach Befiv, but matzah doesn't require Tam Matzah Befiv. So you can eat his dessert after the matzah, after the Afikan. Name of Misayele, should we bring a support for Shmuel according to this transmission? Ein maftir achar Pesach, avikomen achar Pesach to lo, aval achar matzah maftirin. Like Bisman has said that we don't have a Korban Pesach, you're allowed to eat a dessert after the matzah, and the Gemara rejects. Lo mi boy kan. Lo mi boy achar matzah. For sure, you're not allowed to eat after matzah. Lo nafesh tameha, because matzah doesn't have a strong taste. And if he eats something after the matzah, it's going to be mevatel tam matzah befiv, avol yachar pesach emolo. Maybe there's no Easter in eating a dessert after Pesach because the tam of the basar lo yavo. So mashmalon, the Tana wants to teach us that even with regard to tam of Pesach, he's got to be very careful and he's not allowed to eat afterwards, despite the fact that the basar has a profound time.
Why is it only the basar and not everything else in the meal? Like all these nice dishes at the end of the meal, leave a better taste than the basar.
Right, so that's not a problem. Anything that you eat that's a reshus, you can be mavatal the tam. We don't care if you whatever the matzah, but the Pesach is a mitzvah of Pesach. And with regard to the mitzvah of Achilas, Basar Pesach, there's a loch of Shiyahei Tam Pesach B'fi.
Maybe we shouldn't even have the desserts.
After the matzah, Shmuel says we should not be eating any desserts.
Before the matzah,
before the matzah, you can eat as much dessert as you like.
No, but you're ruining the korban, you're eating that during the meal, right?
No, the korban is eaten only at the end of the meal. Allah so. When you're satiated, but not fully satiated.
I know we eat it at the end, but the first part of it was very part.
Yeah, no. Anyone who eats the korban pesach during the meal is making a mistake. He's got to eat the korban pesach at the end of the meal. And zeichel the korban pesach, he has to eat matzah at the end of the meal. And in both cases, when he eats the pesach at the end of the meal or the matzah at the end of the meal, he's not supposed to eat any desserts because he shouldn't be mevatel the tam pesach or the tam matzah in our situation today where we don't have a korban pesach. Now you might ask me a question: why is eating matzah as afikomen a zeichel pesach? I mean, it doesn't even look like, in lulav, we take the lulav today on the second day is exactly as they did in the Beis HaMikdash. It's the same lulav. Or Sfiras Omer, we count the Omer exactly identically as they did with Zman HaMikdash. But here you're eating matzah instead of korban pesach. It's not even meat. But the answer is that when the Mikdash stood, they ate the pesach together with what? With matzah. Because the pasuk says, "Al matzah zumrorim yochlu." Meisvei. The Gemara raises the following objection to Shmuel from the price of lechamoni that we discussed earlier. Sufkanin, vaduvshin vaskritin, adam amali kreso mehem ubulvad sheyochal kizais matzah bachrona in barishona lo. He should not be eating his matzah until the achrona, until the end of the Suda. And the reason for that is because he might be eating something after the achrona. So that's against Shmuel, because Shmuel, according to the second Mishnah, holds that you're allowed to eat after the matzah. So why are you eating it b'achrona? Lomi boy kama, lomi boy rishona. It goes without saying that he's allowed to eat matzah b'rishona, because that's l'teyama. Avol b'achrona. If you're eating it at the end of the meal, you don't have a taiva, you don't have a desire and an appetite to eat it. The osil michachila gas, and not only that, moreover, you might come to eat it when he's cut. Cut means it's repulsive. He's already filled his belly. The Mashmalon, the Tana wants to tell us that we don't have to worry about that, and he's allowed to eat the matzah at the end of the meal. Omar Rava, now we start the new sugya. Matzah bismana zed oraisa. In our time, even though we don't have the Korban Pesach, to join and accompany the Achilas Matzah, so we're eating Achilas Matzah without the Pesach, nevertheless, it's a mitzvah d'oraisa. But Morar midrabanan. But Morar in our time is only d'rabanan. The Heres the Maisa, Matzah is d'oraisa, Morar is d'rabanan. Why is that so? Maishna Morar. Why do you tell me that Morar Bismana says only the Rabbanan and Minat Torah Yapatur from the mitzvah Morar? Because it says in the parasha of Korban Pesach, Al Matzum Rom Yochlu, eat the Korban Pesach with Morar. And today we don't have the Korban Pesach. Bismana the Ika Pesach Yesh Morar. Bismana the Leka Pesach. At our time we don't have a Pesach Leka Morar. If that's your logic, then Matzah Nami Yoksiv Al Matzum Rom Yochlu. So the matzah was eaten together with the Korban Pesach. Today we don't have the Korban Pesach. There's no mitzvah of matzah. And the Gemara says, matzah miheder hader beikra. The Torah has another pasuk that obligates me in matzah. In addition to the matzah that accompanied the Korban Pesach, derived from the pasuk al matzah morim yochlu, we have a separate, independent mitzvah of achilas matzah that's derived from the pasuk ba'erev tochlu matzahs. And Ba'erev Tochlu Matzos commands us to eat matzah regardless of Korban Pesach, with or without the Korban Pesach. The Mara is only meaningful as an accompaniment to the Korban Pesach. But the matzah has a meaning on its own. It separates itself from this trio of the three musketeers of Pesach Matzah Mora, and it's a separate independent mitzvah of matzah, Achilas Matzah, Ba'erev Tochlu Matzahs. So how many mitzvahs are there to eat matzah? 2. You have al matzah rom yochlu, to eat the matzah together with the Korban Pesach, and then you have an independent second mitzvah to eat matzah alone as a mitzvah by itself. But erev tochlu matzahs. Bisman hazeh, we can't fulfill both kiyumim, but we have one mitzvah. Out of the 2 mitzvahs, we have to forfeit the mitzvah al matzah rom yochlu to accompany the Korban Pesach, but we still retain the mitzvah by erev tochlu matzahs as an independent mitzvah of achilas matzah. And that applies Bisman Hazeh, just like it applied Bisman HaMikdash. Had the Torah said to us, but Erev Tochlu Marar, then we'd have separate independent mitzvah of eating Marar, and it would apply Bisman Hazeh without the Pesach. But we don't have such a Pesach. So the Torah only obligated us to eat Marar within the context of Al Matzos Umarorim Yochluhu, the Achil of the Korban Pesach. If we don't have the Korban Pesach, we don't have Marar. Any Marar that we eat, Bisman Hazeh, is only a Zeicher. but it's not a doraisa. Matzah is different. Because in the case of matzah, the Torah went out of its way to take matzah out of the bag, set it up as an independent mitzvah unto itself to eat matzah by Erev Tochel Matzahs. We don't have that, anything parallel in Mara. So when we eat the matzah bisman hazeh, we are fulfilling a mitzvah d'oraisa of ba'erev tochlu matzahs. The second matzah that we eat, that's already zecher l'korban pesach. That's a zecher to the other mitzvah of matzah, which is totally dependent upon the korban pesach. And it's a mitzvah that doesn't apply today.
He's saying that Mara today is not an obligation.
It's the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan wanted us to remember the Mara that we ate bisman hamikdash, but there's no mitzvah d'oraisa. There's no biblical obligation to eat Mara in our time.
Okay, so the Mara is l'zecher.
Correct.
So now there are other things that we do l'zecher, but it's not in here. For example, we have something for l'zecher korban pesach, right?
Like the zroa.
Zroa, right? So why don't we eat at the end of the meal? Why doesn't it ask? Why don't we eat at the end of the meal? What we have is the zroa and matzah.
So that's a Gemara that we didn't do, which is called nirika ochel kachim bachutz. If you eat meat that was designated as a replacement for kachim, then it looks like you're eating meat outside the azar. So, for example, today, this is halacha l'maisa. If you were to take a zroa and call it hegdesh, if you said those words today, what year are we up to? 2023. And you would say this basar is hegdesh, and then you would eat it, you violated a very severe issur of kachim bachutz.
That's why you don't eat the zroa.
And that's why we don't eat the zroa. Some have a minhag of eating the zroa the next day. I would probably discourage such a thing, They would say, well, you know what? If you eat it at the night of the Seder, then it looks like maybe you're eating kachim, because that's the mitzvah of achilas pesach b'layla hazeh. But the next day, who would think that you're eating the korban pesach? You're already beyond the zman of the korban pesach. Even bisman hamikdash, if you ate the korban pesach during the day, you would not fulfill the mitzvah. Now, here we have a new sugya coming up, which really relates to the parsha that we read 2 days ago, which is called Pesach Sheni. And the Torah in Parshas Ba'aloscha tells us on these 2 scenarios, you eat the second korban pesach, which means on Yudalad Be'iyar, a full month later. What are those 2 occasions? Number 1, Tameh. He can't eat the korban pesach because he's Tameh. We have to delay there for a month. And number 2, Haya b'derech rechoka, he was far away. So what would you say about any of those 2 categories? We're imagining that the Mikdash is standing, and you are either b'derech rechoka or you're Tameh. So the korban pesach you're not going to eat on the 15th of Nisan because you're Tameh, or you're b'derech rechoka. What about the mitzvah of matzah? Could such a person fulfill at least the mitzvah of matzah? Well, what would you say, Rabbi Mosai?
Why wouldn't he be able to?
Because the Torah says, "Al matzah sumrom yochlu." There's a package deal of eating the matzah together with the korban pesach.
But isn't there a separate mitzvah of eating matzah?
Excellent.
We have
I owe you big time, Joe.
He answered it. No, but he answered it beforehand while we said the most in the matzah.
I'll tell you what it is. When does matzah become an independent mitzvah? That's when you don't have a korban pesach. There is no korban pesach anywhere on the face of the earth because it's after the churban and we don't have the Beis Hamikdash. So the Torah says, you know what? You can have a mitzvah of matzah because you can eat the matzah with the korban pesach, and we're going to obligate you to eat the matzah even without the korban pesach. But at least there is a Korban Pesach. So when the mitzvah of Al Matzah Rom Yachlu is activated, it applies during that period of time when the Mikdash stands. Now the Torah slaps you or obligates you with another mitzvah of eating matzah. But in our time where we don't even have the mitzvah of eating matzah together with the Korban Pesach, then maybe there is no mitzvah of eating matzah at all. And yet, the Gemara just established, in the name of Rava, if I'm not mistaken, Omar Rava, that matzah bismana says d'oraisa. Why? Because it says b'erev tochlu matzahs. Maybe b'erev tochlu matzahs only applies when you have the mitzvah of al matzah mrom yochlu. If there's a mitzvah to eat matzah with the Korban Pesach, the Torah gives you b'erev tochlu matzahs. But if you don't have the possibility of eating the matzah with the Korban Pesach, so therefore you don't have the mitzvah of al matzah mrom yochlu, maybe there's no mitzvah of eating matzah independently.
So in Pesach Sheni, does he have the obligation of having matzah?
Yes,
the carbon?
Sure, because al matzah mrom yochlu. So maybe
maybe it's different because it's sometimes things change when they're a month later. It's a second.
Right. No, but the halacha is that the Pesach of Pesach Sheni has to be eaten exactly the same way as the Pesach of Pesach Rishon. But I'm just pointing out that the matzah might be schlepped along by the Pesach. And then you could say that the mitzvah of B'erev Tochlu Matzah applies when there is a mitzvah to eat the matzah with the Korban Pesach. But Bisman Hazeh, when there's no Pesach at all, then maybe there's no independent achila of matzah because matzah doesn't apply if Pesach doesn't apply. That's what Rav Acha Bar Yaakov is going to tell us now. Echad zeh v'echad zeh d'Rabbanan. Even matzah Bisman says d'Rabbanan. Yalaho Ksiv, what are you going to do, Rav Acha, with the pasuk b'erev tochlu matzah? It's indicating that there's an independent mitzvah of achilas matzah. Hahi mi boile litame u'lemishaya b'derech rechoko. In other words, if he's not eating the Korban Pesach on the 14th of Nisan, but rather he's going to eat it a month later on the 14th of Iyar, Salkadai Takadmina. Well, guess what? We're going to delay the matzah and link it up with the Korban Pesach, which is going to be a month down the line on your Daled Be'iyah. And therefore, you don't have a mitzvah of achilas matzah. Kamashmala, no. Although you don't have Pesach, but you still have matzah. But Pizman Hazeh, we don't have Pesach at all. This guy is at the time where there is a mitzvah of Pesach. He's going to delay his Pesach for another month because he's a Tameh or B'derech Rechoka. But there is a mitzvah of Pesach. And if there's a mitzvah of Pesach, there is a mitzvah of Matzah. But if Bizman Hazeh we don't have a mitzvah of Korban Pesach, then we don't have a mitzvah of Matzah. So when the Torah says Ba'erev Tochlu Matzahs, it's addressing someone who has the mitzvah of Korban Pesach. He cannot fulfill the mitzvah of Korban Pesach because he's Tamei of Derech Rechoka. And therefore he has an independent mitzvah of Matzah. But today, we don't even have the Pesach at all. And therefore there's no separate independent mitzvah of Achilas Matzah. Okay, Rabbi, say this is where we're going to stop. I'm going to just make a note of it so that we remember where we're up to. And if it's Hashem, in about 5 minutes, we'll start Masechet Sanhedrin. Okay, then, so let's just make a note of where we got up to here, so we'll know where to pick it up. Okay, then, so I'll see you in Mitzvah Hashem in about 5 minutes.